The irony is not just rich, it is radioactive. For decades, the United States has projected itself as the arsenal of democracy, a fortress of industrial might capable of isolating any nation that dares to defy the rules based international order. But today, we are witnessing the collapse of that illusion in real time. The arsenal is hollow. The fortress is built on foundations poured in Moscow, and the very weapons the West uses to threaten its adversaries, from the nuclear warheads in its silos to the F 35 fighter jets patrolling the skies, are effectively held hostage by the supply chains of the Russian Federation. We are standing at a precipice that the establishment media in Washington is terrified to acknowledge. They call it a supply chain disruption. I call it the ultimate historical reckoning. Vladimir Putin's recent suggestion to restrict exports of enriched uranium, titanium, and nickel to the West is not merely a counter-sanction, it is a revelation. It exposes the single most devastating truth of the 21st century. The American empire has sanctioned itself into a corner. It has weaponized the global economy only to find that it is the one standing in the trap. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look beyond the daily news cycle and understand the historical architecture of American power. Since the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the United States has operated on a core assumption that the resources of the world belong to it by right of superior force and moral exceptionalism. For 2 centuries, the grand strategy was simple. The global South provided the raw materials, the copper, the oil, the lithium, the rubber, and the industrial North provided the finished goods and the military protection to keep the trade routes open. It was a parasitic relationship masquerading as commerce. During the Cold War, this dynamic held because the United States was still a titan of production. When the Soviet Union threatened the West, America could outbuild, outmanufacture, and out-innovate its rival. But in the rush to financialize its economy, in the 1,990 seconds, the era of the end of history, the American elite, made a fatal calculation. They outsourced their industrial base, they shut down their smelters, they dismantled their enrichment centrifuges. They convinced themselves that they could control the world through the power of the dollar and the swiftness of the swift banking system, while leaving the dirty work of mining and refining to nations like Russia and China. They thought they were the masters of the universe, offloading the burden of physical labor to the periphery. But in doing so, they handed the keys to their own national security to the very powers they now seek to destroy. This is the Suez moment for the American military-industrial complex. Just as the British Empire realized in 1956 that it could no longer act without the permission of the bond market, the United States is realizing in 2025 that it cannot act without the permission of the Russian mining sector. Consider the sheer absurdity of the situation. The United States Congress passes grandiose bills funding a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, sending billions in lethal aid to weaken Moscow. Yet, at the exact same moment, American utility companies are quietly wiring hundreds of millions of dollars to Rosatom, the Russian state nuclear corporation, because without Russian enriched uranium, 1/4 of American homes would go dark. The hypocrisy is systemic, it is structural, and it is catastrophic. When Vladimir Putin stated that Russia should think about certain restrictions on strategic raw materials, he wasn't just threatening a trade war. He was pulling the pin on a grenade that the West has been holding in its own hand for 30 years. This is not about the price of commodities rising. This is about the inability of the West to physically function as a modern superpower. We are talking about titanium, the metal of the gods, the metal of aerospace. You cannot build a Boeing Dreamliner without it. You cannot build an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter without it. And despite all the rhetoric about decoupling and friendshoring, the reality remains stubborn. VSMPO Avisma, the Russian titanium giant, dominates the global supply chain. The West believed it could sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. Instead, the West is discovering that without Russian resources, it is the one forcing itself into technological regression. The arrogance of the neoliberal order, the belief that you can declare war on a nation's economy while still expecting them to supply you with the fuel for your own tanks, has hit a brick wall. The United States is not facing a temporary bottleneck. It is facing a resource trap of its own making. The era of cheap resource extraction is over. The era of the buyer's market, where the West dictates the price and the terms, is dead. We are entering the age of resource sovereignty, where the nations that pull the metal from the ground hold the leverage over the nations that print the paper currency. And as we will see, Washington has no plan B. The failure of plan A is not a matter of bad luck. It is a matter of bad physics. The architects of the sanctions regime in Washington, London, and Brussels operated under a delusion that belongs in a university seminar room, not in the brutal reality of global supply chains. They believed that the financial system, the digital ledger of ones and zeros that constitutes the Western banking sector, was more powerful than the physical system of atoms, energy, and hard commodities. They wagered that if they cut Russia off from SWIFT, confiscated its foreign reserves, and banned its oligarchs from shopping in Milan, the Russian state would collapse within weeks. They expected the ruble to turn to rubble, as President Biden famously predicted. They expected a compliant surrender. Instead, they catalyzed the most rapid reorganization of global trade in human history. By weaponizing the US dollar, they forced the targeted nations to innovate. And innovate they did. What we are witnessing now is the great circumvention. The sanctions did not isolate Russia. They isolated the West from the resources it desperately needs to maintain its standard of living and its military dominance. Let's look specifically at the mechanics of this failure, because the details are damning. The United States imports roughly a quarter of its enriched uranium fuel from Russia, but the dependency goes deeper than raw percentages. We are talking about a specific type of fuel, HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium. This is the lifeblood of the next generation of advanced nuclear reactors that the green energy lobby claims will save the planet. And here is the punchline that no one in the Department of Energy wants to say out loud. The United States of America, the nation that split the atom, has zero commercial capacity to produce HALEU at scale right now. Zero. Who controls the monopoly on this specialized fuel? Tenex, a subsidiary of the Russian state giant Rosatom. So, while the State Department lectures the world on the moral necessity of boycotting Moscow, the U.S. energy sector is frantically lobbying the White House for waivers. They are begging for permission to continue paying Putin because the alternative is lights out in Virginia, in Illinois, in the Carolinas. This is the definition of a systemic failure. You cannot sanction a monopoly provider when you are the desperate customer. The leverage flows in only one direction, and it is not toward Washington. The situation with titanium is even more humiliating for the Pentagon. Titanium is not just a metal. It is a strategic imperative. It is lightweight, heat-resistant, and stronger than steel. It is essential for the airframes of the F-35, the landing gear of the Boeing 787, and the hull of our naval assets. For years, Western aerospace companies like Boeing and Airbus were joint venture partners with Russia's VSMPO Avisma. They poured money and technology into Russia, helping to build the very Titan they now fear. When the war started, Airbus publicly pleaded with the EU not to sanction titanium, admitting that such a move would be sanctioning ourselves. Boeing claimed it had suspended purchases, but let us be skeptical of corporate press releases. The global supply chain is opaque. Russian metal is simply being rerouted, restamped, and sold through intermediaries in friendly nations, likely at a significant markup. The West is paying a hypocrisy tax. We are buying the same Russian resources, but now we are paying a premium to middlemen in India, Turkey, or China to wash the origin certificate. This brings us to the panic currently gripping the U.S. military-industrial complex. They have realized that the arsenal of democracy has a fatal bottleneck. If Putin makes good on his threat to restrict exports, the production lines of the most expensive weapons systems in history will grind to a halt. You cannot 3D print titanium sponge out of thin air. You cannot print enriched uranium on a Federal Reserve printing press. These are physical realities that cannot be financialized away. And while the West scrambles to find alternatives, Russia has simply pivoted east. This is the circumvention that the Atlanticists said was impossible. They claimed China would be afraid of secondary sanctions. They claimed India would fall in line. They were wrong. The trade between Russia and China has exploded, reaching record highs. They are building new pipelines, new railways, and new payment systems that bypass the dollar entirely. The BRICS alliance is not just a talk shop, it is becoming a commodities cartel. They are creating a closed loop of resource exchange, Russian energy fueling Chinese factories, Chinese manufactured goods flowing back to Russia, leaving the West on the outside looking in. The mechanism of U.S. power, the threat of economic exclusion, has lost its sting. When you sanction the world's largest producer of natural resources, you are not locking them out of the global economy, you are locking yourself out of the global resource base. The U.S. military planners know this. They know that it takes 10 to 15 years to open a new titanium mine or build a new uranium enrichment facility. They know that environmental regulations and litigation in the West make it nearly impossible to reindustrialize at the speed of war. So they sit in the Pentagon, watching the stockpiles dwindle, realizing that the F-35 seconds meant to project American power across the globe are dependent on the goodwill of the Kremlin to even get off the ground. The panic is quiet, but it is palpable. They are realizing that in the game of grand strategy, you cannot bluff with an empty hand. And right now, when it comes to the raw materials of modern warfare, America is holding a pair of twos, while Russia and the global south are holding all the aces. The irony is suffocating. The very sanctions designed to cripple the Russian war machine have instead exposed the fragility of the American war machine. We have entered a trap where every move we make to tighten the screws only strips the threads of our own influence. And as the realization sets in that we cannot win an industrial war against the world's premier industrial resource power, the narrative in Washington is shifting from arrogance to fear. But fear often leads to irrationality. And as we will see, the response to this resource trap is not humility, it is a desperate, moralizing double down that will only accelerate the decline. The desperation we are seeing in the corridors of power is not merely economic. It is the frantic twitching of a predator that has lost its teeth. When the mask of supply chain security slips, what is revealed underneath is the ugly, unvarnished face of the moral trap. For 70 years, the United States has sold a very specific narrative to the world and to its own citizens. We were told that American interventionism was a charitable endeavor. We were told that when the 101st Airborne or the Marine Expeditionary Units landed on foreign shores, they brought with them democracy, human rights, and rule of law. We were asked to believe that the destruction of sovereign nations was a necessary price to pay for the spread of liberty. But looking at the current resource crisis, we can no longer afford to indulge in this comfortable fiction. The historical record is screaming the quiet part out loud. Democracy promotion has almost always been a euphemism for resource extraction. The panic in Washington today over Russian uranium and titanium is not because the West cares about the sovereignty of Ukraine. It is because the West is terrified of losing its entitlement to the cheap resources of the East. We must judge the tree by its fruit. Let us look at the track record of this rules-based international order when it encounters a nation that sits on valuable resources and refuses to sell them at a discount. Look at Iraq. We were told it was about weapons of mass destruction. We were told it was about a madman threatening the world. But when the dust settled and the shock and awe campaign had turned an ancient civilization into a graveyard, no weapons were found. What was found, however, were massive oil contracts. The Iraqi oil industry, previously nationalized and closed off to Western majors, was suddenly cracked open. The democracy that arrived in Baghdad looked suspiciously like a franchise opportunity for Halliburton and Exxon. The result was not stability, it was the fragmentation of a society, the birth of ISIS, and 1 million dead souls. But the resources flowed. That was the deal. Look at Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was a dictator, certainly. But he was a dictator who had committed the cardinal sin of seeking financial sovereignty. He planned to create a gold-backed dinar, a pan-African currency that would have challenged the hegemony of the French franc and the US dollar in Africa. He wanted to sell Libyan oil for gold, not paper debt. And so the responsibility to protect was invoked. NATO bombers turned the most prosperous nation in Africa into an open-air slave market. We came, we saw, he died, laughed the Secretary of State. It was a moment of grotesque hubris. And what was the result? Chaos. Warlords fighting over the scraps. But the threat to the dollar was neutralized. This is the moral trap. The West has convinced itself that its greed is virtuous. It believes that because it calls itself a democracy, it has a divine right to plunder. But this model of coercion is hitting a wall. The reason the establishment hates Vladimir Putin with such visceral intensity is not because he is an autocrat. The world is full of autocrats that Washington adores. Look at the red carpet rolled out for the Gulf. Monarchies. No, they hate Putin because he committed the same sin as Gaddafi, but he had the nuclear weapons to survive it. In the early 2000s, he kicked the Western vultures out of Russia. He nationalized the energy giants. He took the uranium, the gas, and the titanium back under state control. He told the West, you can buy from us, but you will no longer steal from us. That is the unforgivable crime. And now, as the U.S. faces a shortage of the very materials it needs to build its war machine, it finds that the old playbook, invade, destabilize, install a puppet, cannot be used against a superpower. You cannot bring freedom to Moscow with a carrier strike group. You cannot sanction a country into submission when that country holds the keys to your own power grid. The consequences of this moral bankruptcy are now coming home to roost. The world has eyes. The global South has watched the destruction of Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. They see the pattern. They see that partnership with the West usually ends with your country in ruins and your resources in Western ships. This is why the narrative war is being lost. When the U.S. warns African nations about the dangers of doing business with Russia or China, those nations look at the rubble of Tripoli and the chaos of Baghdad, and they laugh. Consider the recent events in Niger. For decades, French and American companies extracted uranium from Niger to power the lights of Paris, while the people of Niger lived in darkness. When the military government in Niamey finally kicked the Western troops out and demanded a fair price for their yellowcake uranium, Washington screamed coup and instability. But the people of Niger called it liberation. And who stepped in to fill the void? Rosatom. The Russians didn't have to invade. They simply offered a deal that wasn't predatory. The U.S. is trapped in its own hypocrisy. It decries Russian imperialism while American troops illegally occupy the oil fields of eastern Syria, literally stealing the oil to deny it to the government in Damascus. It speaks of the sanctity of borders while supporting the annexation of land when it suits its allies. This moral schizophrenia has a cost. It destroys trust. And in a world where you are desperate for titanium and uranium, trust is a commodity you cannot afford to lose. The irony is tragic. By using the values of the West as a weapon to bludgeon competitors, the U.S. establishment has hollowed out those very values. They have made democracy synonymous with instability in the eyes of the global majority. And now, as the resource noose tightens, they are finding that moral posturing generates 0 kilowatts of electricity. You cannot run a nuclear reactor on self-righteousness. You cannot build a fighter jet out of UN resolutions. The bill for decades of coercion is finally coming due, and the currency required to pay it is the one thing the West no longer possesses: credibility. The moral trap is snapped shut, and it is the United States that is caught inside, raging against the dying of the light, while the rest of the world quietly moves on. This is the moment of the great reciprocal escalation. For 30 years, the United States has acted as the sole protagonist of history, believing that it could strike without being struck, sanction without being sanctioned, and destroy without consequence. That era is over. We are now witnessing the arrival of the inevitable counterstroke, a geopolitical reckoning that is asymmetric, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. The ban on enriched uranium and titanium is not an isolated tantrum by the Kremlin. It is a calculated move in a much broader war of attrition that the West is losing simply because it forgot how the game is played. We must understand the nature of this warfare. The Pentagon prepares for kinetic conflict. They build aircraft carriers, they train for dogfights, they simulate tank battles in the Fulda Gap. But the war being waged against the American empire today is not kinetic. It is logistical and industrial. It is asymmetric warfare in its purest form. While Washington spends trillions on the tip of the spear, the shiny, high-tech platforms Russia and China have quietly secured control over the shaft of the spear. They control the inputs, they control the supply chains, and they have realized that you do not need to sink an American aircraft carrier to defeat it. You simply need to cut off the supply of the titanium required to fix its hull or the rare earth magnets required to guide its missiles. This is the strategy of the Anaconda. It is a slow, deliberate constriction. The West, blinded by its obsession with quarterly stock returns and financialized GDP, failed to see the pincer movement developing. On one side, you have Russia, the world's premier resource warehouse. On the other, you have China, the world's premier processing plant. Together, they form an industrial fortress that is immune to Western pressure. When the US restricted the sale of advanced microchips to China, thinking it was a masterstroke of containment, Beijing responded not with missiles, but with a restriction on gallium and germanium, two obscure metals that are absolutely essential for radar systems and semiconductors. Now, Russia is playing the same card with uranium and titanium. Do you see the pattern? The West tries to choke the East with paper sanctions, tariffs, currency restrictions. The East chokes the West with reality, atoms, molecules, and energy. One of these weapons is imaginary. The other is undeniable. The consequences of this asymmetric warfare are already bleeding into the domestic stability of the United States, though the establishment media refuses to connect the dots. This is not just a foreign policy crisis. It is a national security emergency that translates directly into inflation and instability at home. Think about what happens when the supply of Russian enriched uranium is severed. It is not just a headache for utility companies. It is a supply shock that ripples through the entire energy market. If nuclear plants have to throttle down or pay exorbitant prices for fuel on the spot market, electricity rates skyrocket. When energy becomes expensive, everything becomes expensive. Manufacturing costs rise, food production costs rise, and the inflation that is already crushing the American middle class accelerates. This is the hidden tax of the new Cold War. Every time Washington decides to pick a fight with a resource superpower, the American citizen pays the price at the gas pump and the grocery store. Furthermore, the global South is watching this Titan wrestle, and they are placing their bets. This is the diplomatic mobilization we warned about. The nations of Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia see that the US dollar is weaponized, so they are flocking to the BRICS alliance. They see that Western supply chains are fragile, so they are signing long-term contracts with Moscow and Beijing. The narrative of Western isolation of Russia is a myth. The only thing being isolated is the G7. We are seeing a diplomatic revolution. Countries like Saudi Arabia, once stalwart American client states, are now coordinating oil production cuts with Russia. Why? Because they understand the shift in the winds. They know that in a world of resource scarcity, the producer is king. The United States, having depleted its own strategic petroleum reserve for political points during the midterms, has lost its leverage. We are shouting orders at a world that has stopped listening. This leads us to the terrifying reality facing the U.S. military. The rhetoric of fighting a two-front war against Russia and China is delusional when we cannot even secure the supply chain for a peacetime footing. We are running out of 155 millimeters artillery shells. We are months behind on submarine maintenance. And now we face the prospect of losing the titanium needed to build new airframes. This is the hollowing out of the empire exposed for all to see. We have a financialized economy that produces debt, fighting against physical economies that produce steel, fuel, and food. In a long war, the side with the physical capacity always wins. The stock market cannot fight a war. Hedge funds cannot occupy territory. And branding campaigns cannot enrich uranium. The asymmetric warfare of the 21st century has revealed that the emperor has no clothes and, more importantly, no armor. The defense industrial base that won World War II is being sold off for scrap and outsourced to the very rivals we now label as existential threats. The stupidity of this strategic suicide is breathtaking. We handed our enemies the knife and then bared our throat, arrogant enough to believe they would never cut us because they wanted our dollars. Now, the knife is at the throat. The global south is rising, not with rhetoric, but with resource sovereignty. The rules-based order is collapsing because the people who wrote the rules forgot that you cannot legislate geology. The reckoning is here. The inflation is here. The industrial paralysis is here. And as we move to our final analysis, we must ask, is there any way out? Or is the United States destined to follow the path of Rome, clinging to its delusions of grandeur, even as the aqueducts run dry? The choice is stark, but the window to make it is closing faster than a reactor shutting down without fuel. We have arrived at the twilight of empire. The crisis of uranium and titanium is not merely a logistical hiccup, it is the death knell of the unipolar moment. We are witnessing the end of the aberration that was the post-Cold War era, where one nation believed it could dictate the rhythm of the entire planet. The United States now stands at a definitive crossroads, facing a binary choice that will determine the trajectory of the next century. It is a choice between adaptation and denial. Adaptation would require a quality that has been entirely absent from Washington for generations: humility. It would require the American establishment to look in the mirror and admit that the project of global hegemony has failed. It would mean accepting that the United States is just one great power among many, not the indispensable nation. It would involve negotiating with Russia and China as equals, respecting their security interests, and integrating into the new multipolar reality. It would mean ending the sanctions wars, bringing the troops home, and focusing on the difficult generational task of reindustrializing the American homeland. It would mean trading the arsenal of democracy for a functional electrical grid and a viable manufacturing base. But let us not be naive. History teaches us that empires rarely choose the path of wisdom. They choose denial. They choose to rage against the dying of the light. The psychological cost of admitting that the city on a hill is dependent on the minds of the enemy is simply too high for the elites to bear. Their entire worldview, their moral superiority, and their political legitimacy are built on the myth of exceptionalism. To admit that they need Russian titanium is to admit that they are not gods but mortals. So we must prepare for the likely outcome. The empire will double down. They will print more money to hide the inflation. They will launch more proxy wars to hide their diplomatic isolation, and they will scream louder about values even as they lose the capacity to project power. But reality is relentless. You can print dollars, but you cannot print energy. You can sanction a bank, but you cannot sanction a continent. The resource trap has snapped shut. The West is now the prisoner of its own hubris, locked in a cage built of its own sanctions. As the sun sets on the Atlantic century, it rises on the Eurasian century. The control of the world is shifting from the hands of the financial speculators in New York and London to the hands of the resource producers in the global south. This is the return of history. The illusion is over. The only question remaining is how much wreckage the falling giant will create before it finally hits the ground. This channel is dedicated to exposing the mechanisms of power that the mainstream media is paid to ignore. We analyze the world as it is, not as the State Department wishes it to be. If you want to survive the shift to the multipolar world with your eyes open, you need to be here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The era of comfortable lies is over. Welcome to the desert of the real. Do you believe the United States will ever accept a multipolar world, or will it risk a global conflict to maintain its fading hegemony? If Russia and China completely cut off strategic resource exports tomorrow, How long do you think the U.S. economy could survive before a total industrial collapse?